You primitive screwheads, listen up.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
Here's Johnny.
Vanity. Definitely my favorite setting.
I am the devil, and I am here to do the devil's work.
The power of Christ compels you!
This is my boomstick!
What's your favorite scary movie?
What up, horrorheads, and welcome to Shiver, a horror movie podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Daniel DeBona.
And I'm David Ulloa.
And we are 124 episodes in, and I still every time hesitate when I do intro like I'm forgetting a word. Like I noticed it last time I did it, and I did it tonight too. I was like, wait, do I say it? Every time in my head, my brain goes, you say another episode. Then I'm like, no, I don't. I just say it. Anyway, we are continuing with the year of the monster, specifically the month of April being dedicated to vampires. And we are headed to the not South Pacific. That's like Polynesian stuff. We're headed to Asia and South Korea. That's where I got South from. Mm-hmm. And we are doing a movie by the absolutely amazing director known as Incomparable. There's the right word. Yeah. Known, of course, as Park Chan-Wook, or as his name was Americanized, his films were released over here, Chan-Wook Park. And this is his dive into the vampire subgenre with Thirst, released in 2009. And I believe this was both of our first time seeing this one. And it is something. So in a section that we are calling Baptism by Blood, take us through your initial thoughts on Thirst, Dave.
Okay, so expectations were high because while I haven't seen the entirety of is it the Vengeance trilogy?
The Vengeance trilogy, yes, sir.
The Vengeance trilogy. Old Boy is one of those movies that haunts you. Right. And that is wow. So expectations were high. Obviously Park Chan-Wook is like, he's the man. He was my introduction to Korean cinema. Right. So so there's kind of like a standard that he set for me with Old Boy, which incidentally is after this.
Right.
Is it not?
No, no. Old Boy was pre 2009. I want to say now. I think
the remake was after.
Yes, Old Boy's 2003.
Okay, yeah, okay. So I have very rarely, I think, been so absolutely in love with a movie's cinematography, with the art direction of a movie. I was enthralled. To me, it was almost like watching a moving painting. There's so much beauty in this. And then I thought I recognized the plot. And I was like, I don't remember vampires in this, but sure enough, this is the plot from an old Emile Zola book, which I read in college. And it was called Therese. Yeah, Therese something. I can't remember the last name of the character. Is it Raquin or
Raquin? Raquin?
Yes, Raquin. There it is. So so I was like, oh fuck, and I adore French realism.
And just for reference, you're not saying Arnim Zola, right? Like you're not referencing.
I am not referencing Marvel Comics here. But he's one of my favorite French writers, and so I had to stop. I'm like, this reminds me so much. And when I looked it up, I'm like, fuck, that is the book. And there's so much of that book in here, but it's been totally adapted in a way that I think only Asian cinema does, because we've seen this with Akira Kurosawa too, and South Korean and Japanese are not the same cinema, but stylistically there's a lot of shared DNA there. He did the same thing with Shakespeare, with both Macbeth and with King Lear, where he
Right.
adapted these stories in such a unique and beautiful way. And I saw that here. I'm like, fuck, this is I finished the movie and immediately started it again. It's wow. Wow. Speechless. I'm speechless, man.
Yeah, this is a movie that has been on my list for a long time. I have seen the entire Vengeance trilogy. So when it very first started, that was my first thought was like, oh man, like that's the dude from Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance
Mhm.
was the very first thought I had when it started. And I was like, okay, great. Like have your crew, let's go. So I'm starting to watch this thing and I'm sitting there and it's rolling on and immediately I'm like, okay, so like you, I'm okay, this is gorgeous. This is great. There's obviously going to be higher themes at play here as we're dealing with a priest who's getting lectures about whether or not people want to become martyrs. So he's doing all of this. And then it keeps going. And there was a moment where I was like, oh no, like what if this is because after the Vengeance trilogy, Park Chan-Wook riding high, I was like, God, what if this is like can't pull its head out of its own ass arse?
Mm.
I started to worry about that for a minute. I started to be like, oh, this is gonna be like some take on vampire. Bah, bah, bah. I started having all these thoughts because it does take a little bit for it to start developing.
Yeah.
But man, once the rubber meets the road, this movie is relentless.
Yeah.
It is one shocking thing after another. And I too I was enthralled. I did not start this movie until a little after 10 o'clock my time last night. Didn't realize that it was 2 hours, 16 minutes long.
Mhm.
And not once did I pick up my phone, did I pause it to get up off the couch and do anything else. Like my notes are crazy sloppy because I didn't want to look away from the screen to write
Mhm.
stuff down. There are so many things to this story, to the style of it, to the acting, all of the things that we're going to talk about that just blew me away. Like one of the things, since we don't really necessarily, we're not necessarily going to have a section just about filmmaking today. One of the things that was so cool is occasionally you'd be watching and it felt like the style of shooting suddenly became very different and very old school. So you'd be watching and everything's smooth, and then all of a sudden you'd get something that would have these hard cuts or these real
Mhm.
quick zooms and pans that felt like an old kung fu movie or something like that. Like I kept waiting for that.
That old golden harvest sound
Yeah,
effect.
exactly.
Yeah.
Like I kept waiting for that too, just to sell all of it. And then every time you get settled into what this movie is, it becomes something else. And that was what kept me going. Was every time I was like, okay, so he's a vampire, but he's going to be opposed to it because he's a priest. And then it's like, oh, well, he's a vampire and now he doesn't want to be a priest anymore because he got some of that sweet, sweet wang dang sweet poontang, right? And then it's like, oh no, now he's a murderer. And it just and then the end act 3 of this movie is so mind-bendingly insane
It's wild.
that you're just this. I will say this: if you are listening to this, I've had a couple people who will occasionally say, "Oh yeah, I listened to your such and such episode, then I went and watched the movie." If that's the way you love to do things, that's fine. So let me tell you here at the top: when you go to watch this movie, I really feel like this is a love it or hate it kind of movie. I feel like this thing is either going to suck you in and you're going to be all about it, or I feel like halfway through you're just going to be dreading another hour and 7 minutes.
Mhm.
I was sucked in, and this movie was spectacular.
Yeah, and I think very much owing to its French realist roots, it's exactly the ending it needs to be. And sometimes the ending it needs to be is not the ending that we want.
Right.
And again, this is like I think should be the last time that we're going to warn you that we're going to talk about this movie this movie from 2009. So I don't feel like I'm spoiling anything. But if you're finding out about this movie from this show, and you're interested in going along for the ride, stop watching or listening now and watch and then come back.
Definitely come back.
But I love that this did not give us the happy ending.
Yeah.
And I love that it didn't give us the storybook ending, because I feel like that's how life is for most people. You know,
Right.
how rare is it that everything works out and it's all tied up in a neat little bow?
Right.
It just, you know, it works in the movies, and that's great, that's fine, you know, for a movie like Endgame to end with, you know, Cap and Captain Carter dancing, and that's beautiful. It's
Yeah.
absolutely beautiful. I wept, but it's not real, you know.
Yeah.
Even if even if time travel was real,
Yeah.
I don't believe that would be the real ending to that
Yeah,
story.
there's vampires in this one, and it's like maybe that ending's more realistic.
So I just, you know, I'm glad that the story developed the way that it did, and it gave us an opportunity to see how people behave in certain situations, and that's what I think this movie does really, really well. Maybe better than anything else. Is this isn't a movie about a story.
Right.
And there's a great story here, but it's not about the story. It's about the people. Because if this story happens with two different characters that are motivated by totally different things, you have a totally different movie. There's no Deus Ex Machina here, where
That's a good point. Like if you execute the story the same way, but you give me different characters motivated differently, and the movie plays out extraordinarily differently. I
yeah.
like that's an interesting take. I like that.
And to me, that is the most amazing thing about this movie, is that what we're along for is not necessarily the ride, because pretty much from the moment that you know what the story is, you kind of know where it's going.
Right.
And you have a pretty good feeling that even if it's not going to be one of those things where it's like, I called exactly what's going to happen, but you knew more or less what was going to happen. But you were along not for the ride of the story, but you were along for the ride of the characters, because you wanted to see what was going to happen next. What was she going to do next? What was he going to do next? Because they were kind of loose cannons,
A little bit.
that were flying by the seat of their pants, because they were both so virginal in every sense of that word. They were so new to life as a human being, and also life reborn as a vampire. So we're starting to get to it. So in a section we're calling "It's a Love Story, Baby, Just Say Death." The story here
in my head now.
Yeah, it's a love story, baby, just say death. I'm not gonna sing that. I
He
can't
says
sing it.
after singing it.
I tried and then decided, you know what? Let me just speak this. What did it do for you? The story, the plot, the character development. What did it do for you here?
So the story of this movie, the priest of Sangyeon getting this disease called the Emmanuel virus, volunteering himself to get it so they could try to cure it, dying, coming back because of a blood transfusion that gave him vampirism. So, but as far as anybody else knows, he's just this miracle man who's the first, non-African to survive the Emmanuel virus.
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes back to his parish and they are worshiping him. They've taken crucifixes and wrapped them in bandages because he comes back wrapped in bandages. They're camping out near the monastery where he was just to try to get a glimpse of him. People are begging him to pray for them and over them and to just be there for their family. Mm-hmm. So he, moves forward with his life and things keep going. And he ends up meeting an old friend whose cancer goes away after he prays over him, and his wife, who is certifiably insane. And then that's and then that's where the story takes off, right? There are so many twists and turns through this movie that it's always exciting. This movie is just, it's without a ton of action scenes. There's a handful of actiony scenes where they're actively hunting or fighting, or I mean, what they're eating, they're fighting, and they're fucking. Like, once they become vampires, like that's life.
But it's really it's a talking movie, not a doing movie.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but even through all those talking parts, the development of these characters and everything they go through, from becoming this guy who doesn't feel like his faith is enough to becoming this priest who just knows he has to be a vampire to live, but he doesn't want to hurt anybody, to becoming somebody who just, he ends up aiding people who want to commit suicide. Whereas one of the very first times we see him, he talks somebody out of committing suicide, right? Like, that's how circular Sang-yoon's story becomes. There's just so much here. The struggles that he has with himself, the struggles that he has with his decisions, and he's just constantly running into people who want something from him, and he doesn't know how to live that life. There's these parishioners that want his prayers. There's the other monk, the blind monk, who wants to become a vampire so he can see again. Everybody wants something from him. Ultimately, the girl who becomes his girlfriend, Taeju, she wants his entirety. She wants his soul. She wants everything that's wrapped up in him. And he's a guy who doesn't know how to handle this. And you said, as viewers, we're not along for the ride here. But as you watch the movie, Sang-yoon is just along for the ride. He doesn't know how to handle the life that he had before he became a vampire. Now he's overcome by all of these urges. And for what it seems like the first time, a girl wants him and it actively pursues him, is not putting it strong enough. So you get this this encapsulating, has all of your attention film for 2 hours, just always desperately wondering what is going to happen next. And sure, I worried that it was going to be too heavy on the religious themes, because that can go one way or the other. You can batter it, you can shove it down my throat. Either way, I tend to not like it. But that was really just that was, that the MacGuffin was just that he was a priest.
Yeah, it was like a blip on the story.
And you just end up getting this story of what happens if Joe Blow becomes a vampire and really desperately still just wants to be Joe Blow.
Right. I think that aspect of the story is the one that I may have most enjoyed. I haven't decided yet. Here's the thing that strikes me most about it. He goes to the lab, right? To be
studied for the Emmanuel virus,
right? To be purposely infected so that he can help cure this virus, right? And he's he's a learned man. He can help, right?
Right.
He then there is given the opportunity to heal infinite numbers of people, which is ultimately what he wants to do. He wants to heal people, spiritually, physically, psychologically. Like, he wants to help people. He's given the ability to help people because as a vampire, he could use his newfound abilities for good. And it's the last thing he does.
Yeah.
It totally changes him. Having the ability to help others in ways that they couldn't possibly be helped before changes him. And I think that is maybe the most interesting thing here, because if that were another character, this whole movie is different.
Right.
If that were Chan-Wook
Yeah.
instead of him, totally different movie. And that is what I like now I'm trying to get inside his brain. You know, like what is it that really drove him? Did he want to help people because he felt powerless? He himself is an orphan who needed to rely on the generosity of others, right? Whether it was Kang-Woo's family or whether it was the church, he was dependent upon the generosity of others, the charity of others to survive, the kindness of others to survive. And now that he doesn't need that, fuck the little guy. I'm not the little guy anymore.
Right.
And then interestingly, when Taeju sees that there's an opportunity for her to escape this life that she hates, she actively pursues that life.
Oh yeah.
And so even though their paths are not necessarily divergent paths, they're paths that wind in totally different ways, and what you end up having is two radically different experiences when what they want ultimately is each other. And passion is this thing where, like, when it's hot, and there's nothing that's going to drive you away from that thing, and nothing is going to get in the way of it either. And so they secure their own relationship in this movie. They make sure that it happens, and he's as active a participant in that as she is, but it's done in such a totally different way.
Yeah.
That the thing that I think makes me sad at the end of this movie is not that it didn't work out between them, because it didn't work out between
them. It did not.
But it's that at the end of the movie, nothing has changed for either of them. He's still a man that is beholden to the institutions that made him, and in effect a slave to that mentality. And she is still second banana.
Yeah.
She's not, with all the power that she has, and she becomes more powerful than him. There's a line there that she's like, you're a coward drinking easy blood when you could be taking blood and fear. And that to me is like, there's a couple of vampire movies where there's lines like that where it's like, yeah, it tastes better, it is better, it makes me stronger when I have to hunt for it, when I'm not going to a grocery store, you know?
Right, like in Interview with the Vampire.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing, right? Where, you know, Lestat is he's just feasting on rats and stuff like that in the sewers, and then you've got Pontiac is like is just disgusted by it, like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, doesn't understand why you wouldn't go for the good fresh stuff,
right? And so she could apparently fight him off, and yet it still wasn't enough. And she still, like, her outcome was decided for her. So that to me is the saddest thing about this movie, is ultimately her story, because every decision that he makes leads to the next decision, and in one way or another he is responsible for his own story. She tries to be, and is damned for it. And I think this is something that you see a lot in Zola's writing. I can't say that it's something that you see in Park's movies, because I've only ever seen Old Boy.
right?
But I feel like we see that theme play out in Old Boy too, where it's like, you're not in control of your own destiny, and try to control it. That's fine, but fuck you.
Right. You know, it's and I mean, yeah, ultimately in Old Boy, the final scene, it's like, oh yeah, no, I didn't control anything, right?
Right.
So One of the things that's really interesting about this story to me is when you look at when you look at everything that he goes through, and it's interesting because of how real it feels sometimes the way he reacts to different things. So when they have sex for the first time, or just or almost have sex for the
Yeah.
first time,
Or kind of have
yeah,
sex.
or
Yeah.
that is a rapey line that she was crossing there, but
It is. Yeah.
but after that, in that moment, he just completely embraces this
Mhm.
as this is who he is now, right? I mean, in the same way that like every let's say 16 to like 19-year-old guy that has sex for the first time does, right?
Mhm.
And it's so easy to say that you're gonna hold out, you're never gonna do it, or you're gonna not gonna do it until you're married or whatever, and then sex is the sweetest drug, right, that
Yeah. Oh,
exists.
absolutely.
And man, he gets that first taste, and he is a 17-year-old kid that it's all he can think of. And he's suddenly this just suave, like, I mean, he goes, he goes up there and they're playing mahjong, and he's like, yes, I'll have to come by on Sundays and Wednesdays, and he's all about it, and it's his whole persona now.
Mhm.
And so that changed him, and he fought back against it for just a second when she showed up at the hospital,
Mhm.
but it went down. So you have that major change in his life that he embraced and embraced with a fervor.
Mhm.
And then you have when he actually kills her husband, and that destroys him as a person, which is I kind of found that to be a very interesting look at this idea of sins happening in varying degrees, right?
Right.
And so because he says, oh, it's worse if I do it because I'm a priest.
Mhm.
And so he's in his head in that moment, having sex as a priest is on par with anything else that's going to happen. Then he gets some and he's like, oh no, never mind, it's not that bad, need more of that. So then the logical through line there is he was like, man, I gave up on that. I had some sex and it was amazing. What if all of that is bullshit, right? And now I can kill somebody and that's going to be amazing too. And so, he goes along with this and it just wrecks him. And once again, he's in this crisis of faith and trying to conflate what's happening with what he's learned before in the past and trying to find where the gray area between all of these things is. And such a chunk in the middle of this movie is him having to deal with the fact that he killed his buddy, especially once he finds out it was done on false pretenses.
Mhm.
That's when the wheels come off, is when he finds out that Teju actually was never beaten by her husband. She was stabbing herself with, I believe that was a seam ripper.
Yeah.
That she kept stabbing herself with just so she could sell that story because she wanted him dead. And so now he's being lied to by what the only woman he's ever loved. He's a murderer. He's a vampire. Everything is so bizarre, but he still tries to find a way to make it work with what has kept him alive all this time, and that's leaning on others. So he starts to lean on her. She's nuts. So he goes to lean on the other friar from the monastery and realizes that the only thing the friar wants from him now is his blood. He doesn't care anything about him, which, by the way, the first time we met him, we were not led to believe that the friar that he called friend cared that much about him anyway.
Yeah.
And now he's faced with this. And so again, in crisis, all he's ever done is lean on other people, going to his friend's house for dinner, like you said, going to the church. And now everybody that he's chosen to confide in with what is this massive secret is not turning out to be the rock that he needs. And he has no idea what to do, which, interestingly enough, historically is why a lot of people turn to religion. But he's now in a place where he has abolished that from his life and is what he views as a monster who is beyond saving from religion. So when he's leaned on all he's ever done, lean on all these other people, and now he's got nothing. By the time that he turns Teju and they take over the house, he's a broken man. You know, he's trying to have conversations with her. She's nuts. And he's got no fight left. He he halfway grabs her. She ends up kind of slamming her face. But then she still, just kind of smacks him around, carries on about their business. And it's like, oh, it's Mahjong night. And they got to carry on. It's just, it's interesting how he went through that phase and then was in a place where so many people would turn to religion. But now this was a guy it wasn't an option for. And so what do? Well, like we said, you don't get the happy ending. And he comes to grips with the fact that there's no one left to lean on, that the one person left in his life he thought he had doesn't need to be in this world anymore. And without her, he's nothing. So he puts them both in the sunlight. And he reaches his own sort, that he ends the story on his terms in the only way that he deems worthy of everything that they've gone through.
I think that's a really good analysis of his story, and one that I'm totally on board with. I would offer an alternative to one thing, though.
Please do.
And that's that I don't think Taeju is nuts. I think that she's desperate.
Okay.
Because there are moments of lucidity that we see creep through. And I think that she has forced herself to be nuts to cope with her life, because I was not abandoned as a child, so I don't know what that feels like, but I have to imagine that can't feel nice, that Fair. Like these two people who presumably are the ones who should love you most unconditionally would just abandon you. And then that this woman who has raised you more or less hates you.
Yeah. She treats you like a dog, like quite literally.
Right. The only purpose you serve to her is to legitimize her son.
Yeah. Free labor.
As a man and free labor.
Yeah.
And then her son is, man boy doesn't begin to describe him.
The fact that he is constantly shown quite literally as a snot-nosed piece of shit. Yeah. Like it's always he's a mama's boy to the nth degree.
Yeah. And that was one of the things that I kind of like drew a line back to the novel is he's a hypochondriac in the novel. So he's constantly suffering from something. So he doesn't respect her. He doesn't look at her as a woman.
Right.
She's just the person who's always existed in his life. He doesn't value her. So I think that for her desperation is what drove her to the brink of insanity. But I think that what she did was very, very purposeful and very, very well thought out. What she didn't count on was guilt.
Right.
And that's the thing that that's the Achilles heel always for the people who plot murder against those that I guess they care for in some way or used to care for. It always comes back to guilt, it's the telltale heart. And so it led to, I think, some of the most comedic scenes, because this is a really funny movie.
This movie
on
is
many occasions. It led to some of my favorite scenes where Kang-woo is just between them with his rock.
Oh my God.
His rock.
when they're having sex and he's like, we just got to push through. He's not really there. And then he's literally laying between them. Oh, I laughed so hard.
It's hysterical, man. It's so funny. And I think that that's one of the things that maybe I didn't expect in this was how deftly the humor would be handled here, because it's woven seamlessly into what is a very dramatic and horrific story.
Correct. Yeah. So you think to you, and I agree with this, Nudge, that Teju is more Suicide Squad Harley Quinn, less like animated series Harley Quinn. Right? Like she's kind of got her shit together. She's got a plan, and she's on the brink, but is always holding it together well enough.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's a really great way of of connecting the dots there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things about this story, the moment that put my jaw on the floor is very end of this, when they just get in the car and they load up Kang-woo's mom and they just go driving. He's not telling anybody where they're going. And you see all of a sudden he's back at what is, like a shanty town that they built outside of his monastery. These people who were worshiping him when he returned. And you have this moment where you see him at least making this woman believe that he was attempting to rape her. From the way that the scene is shown, he has not disrobed her at all. He has just pulled his pants down and has pinned her down. So,
and I think I'm always a proponent for male nudity.
Bring it on, right? I mean, if there's
always,
even though boobs come two at a time, I'm really starting to wonder if we've seen more dicks than boobs. In
this show, we've definitely seen more dicks than boobs.
It's because A24 gives them to us by the dozen.
Baker's doesn't even. But I think that the nudity in that scene is integral to understanding that he has not actually raped her.
Right.
And all he's trying to do is destroy his image.
He needs no one. He knows he's done, and he wants to leave this world with no one who still holds him in high esteem. Mm-hmm. He knows what he's become. He knows what he's done with his life. And just like that prayer he says at the beginning, I want no cheeks so no tears can roll down them. I want no limbs so I can flail. He lives that at the very end. And so all that's left is this one group of people who are just isolated from anything else that may be happening. And so, yes, I don't for a second believe that he had some sort of moment where he was like, one last hurrah, and was going to rape this woman. He needed the image of the bandaged saint, or whatever it was that they called him at the beginning, to be shattered. He needed that to not be his legacy. He wanted what anybody remembered of him to be awful, because he knew he'd become an awful person. And so when they open that up, because it's not like he whips around and he's like, oh my gosh, you found me. He just turns around and he's like, yep, thank you. Like, this is what I needed. And I'm a disgusting individual. And now you all know that. So this is fantastic. Everything about that scene was so incredible, and it showed such a level of self-awareness that we didn't get from him throughout that movie, when he realized that there was nothing left in this world for him. And then it just takes us to that final scene. You talk about how this movie's funny. The final showdown between him and Teju,
it's hysterical.
It is Three Stooges level funny, because she's desperately trying to stay alive and he's just going and kicks the trunk open, drags the car off of her, does all of this stuff.
And the way that she pouts when she picks up the trunk of the car and then she looks over at him and slams it back down, and then has to still jiggle it into place.
Yes, and she has to adjust it. Like, for all of the drama and horror of this movie, for that to be their final hurrah, what was, the two people who were ultimately the most powerful things in this area of Korea. It was so great, and it was so funny, and it was so perfect. It was just this incredible climax of everything that had happened. And so that entire ending part, just like I said, I was picking my jaw up.
Yeah, and at the same time, because I found myself feeling like not knowing how to feel, because I was laughing at like the sort of comedic angles there, but also feeling really sad, because at the same time it's like she's fighting for her life. She wants desperately to stay alive, and he's taking that choice away from her.
Right.
And it's the last decision that will ever be made in her life, and she's not making it.
Which, again, circular storytelling, that's where she came from, right?
Yeah.
That's the reason she is who she is, because she has lived a life where none of her decisions, she was brought in by this family. She was told she was going to marry this guy. She was told she had to work at this shop. She didn't get to make any of those choices.
Yeah, exactly. So beautiful ending in its own way.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, I mean, we've run all over them. So, we might as well just get to the section where we can focus on, if there's anything left, in a section we're calling Clergy and Townies. There's a handful of people in this movie, but only a couple that I think are really worth talking about. So we've mentioned a lot of them. Dive in on somebody, Dave.
Okay, so we have talked pretty much this whole time about Kang Ho Song as Sang Hyun and Kim Ok-vin as Tae-ju. So I am not going to talk about either of them. They carry this movie. They are spectacular together. Alone, they're amazing. This movie does not need a sequel. It can't have a sequel. But if it could, I would watch it in a heartbeat.
Right.
Thanks to them. So I'm going to talk about the side characters. And for me, the one who, like, I will always think about this guy whenever I think about this movie is Shin Ha-kyun as Kang-woo. He just like fucking had me in stitches. He's fucking hysterical.
Yes.
There's something about his face. He manages to give you like moron, but also innocent, but also fuck you, all at the same time. I don't know how he does it. And maybe it's because I found myself like falling head over heels in love with Tae-ju. But like I was like, dude, like just you have this amazing wife. Fucking like just dude, what the fuck? And so like being frustrated with him, but then also like the mama's boy thing you were talking about, like you just want to slap him around a little bit, like grow the fuck up. And he does it so well. And everything from how insignificant everything is to him. And that's talking about like things that happen in his life and the people in his life. The whole movie hinges on him, really.
Yeah.
And he does a spectacular job of keeping you engaged the entire time, because is he going to die? I don't know. He dies. Is he going to stick around? Oh yeah, he is. Okay. And then just the way that he continues to be involved in the story, even when he's not involved in the story, is awesome.
And just, man, and just his face,
Yeah.
like it's so ridiculous. From the very first time that we meet him, when they show up at the hospital, he's like, have you ever been to Busan? And it's like, and he's amazed, and then it comes together that they know each other and stuff like that.
So expressive.
Yes, that's the thing. It's just constant expression.
Mm-hmm.
He is also in Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance, and
okay.
with with the guy with Song Kang Ho again. And if we have any Korean listeners, we're sorry, we're trying. We do really respect this. And so he's also in Joint Security Area, which is another Park Chan-Wook film that he did. But yeah, that guy he was so good. One character that ended up being huge throughout the whole thing, and whether it was, you know, for being awful at the beginning to just kind of being clueless, because I don't know that awful is the right word, because I don't think she was awful, but Mrs. Ra, Kang Woo's mother, she was wildly good.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you're immediately hit with this thing. It's like, okay, she's just an overbearing mother-in-law. But then you start to look and it's like, well, but I mean, she runs a business, and she you know, she brought in this orphan, and I'm not saying she's, you know, an amazing person, but it's one of those things where your immediate thought is that she's just like, oh God, she sucks.
Yeah.
And then you kind of start to dissect it a little bit, and you're like, I mean, not really. Like, maybe some of the things she does suck, but it's not that she's doing them spitefully. She's doing things traditionally. She's doing things that are good for her family. But where her character takes such a great turn in being amazing, and not so much the character as much as it is Kim Hae-suk's acting. And that is once she becomes catatonic.
Yes.
And she still manages to be a part of scenes with just her eyes. The way her eyes get big and she whips them left to right. You always know what she's thinking or what she's feeling. There's never any doubt of when she's scared or when she, you know, figures out what's going on, or when she's put the pieces together, and you're never wondering what she's thinking or feeling, even though she doesn't say a word from that moment forward. I couldn't believe how amazing she was acting in a catatonic state. It was so good. And, you know, again, the comedic elements of this, she's, you know, they bring her to mahjong night and they're like, oh, you want to play? Okay. You know, short blink is yes, long blink is no. And they're literally pinching her nose and pouring vodka down her throat and all this, you know, and you can see in her eyes, she's trying to get them to see what we can see as the audience, because we know what she's been through. And she's trying to convey to them, like, these two are monsters. These two killed my son. Please get me out of here. This is god awful. And all of that with just her eyes was so cool.
She, I wasn't certain who I was going to pick at first, but I knew that the second one would be the other. And so for me, I mean, it's really them two after the two stars, and she really is, I think, the third player. If this were like a 3-character play,
Right,
she's the third player here. And she, it's so weird because, like, there's like a sort of elegant grace to her,
yes,
and yet every scene where she's like very refined is followed up by a scene where she's stinking drunk,
yes,
and she plays both those characters with ease.
yeah. When I went and looked her up today, because I didn't recognize her from anything, so I went and looked at it. It was funny to see she's been acting since the 70s and didn't do a lot between the mid 70s and the early 2000s. And then in the early 2000s, she got cast in a role as someone's mother, and then 50+% of her film since then, mothers. Like, she gets what it takes, apparently, to portray a Korean mother on film. Because when you go look, I mean, it's from 76 to 2002 is 25% of her listings. And then in 2002, she plays somebody's mother, and then you just go down from there, and it's like Mrs. Lee, Duso's mother, Sang-ho's mother. Like, that's always what she is she's always a Mrs. or a somebody's mother. So, and this one falls way down in there. So we were fortunate enough to meet her when she had ironed out any wrinkles that she had in this ability to portray somebody's mother on screen, because you're absolutely right. I think that she is, she's the character that fills the gaps there at the end.
I love when an actor goes through some sort of transformation like that. The other one that comes to mind is Leslie Nielsen.
Yeah,
he was like a serious actor.
You told me about that on the show.
A movie that I hope one day we maybe might get to here is Forbidden Planet, because it's definitely sci-fi, but I feel like there's enough horror in it. Like, there's an invisible monster, there's like evil robots. Like, it's, I think, horror enough that I don't think anyone's going to argue if we do it. And he plays the Captain Kirk role in it. And in fact, Gene Roddenberry has said that was one of the movies that kind of made him say, "Oh, maybe I could do Star Trek."
Right.
So Kirk was like directly influenced by his performance, by Leslie Nielsen's very serious performance as a spaceship captain. And no one remembers this.
Right.
You know, like, everyone remembers Leslie Nielsen as,
Naked Gun.
Naked Gun. Yeah, I was gonna say Police Squad. It's not Police. That was the TV show. As Naked Gun. You know, everyone remembers him as that, or as fucking Dracula. You know, in Dead and Loving It. Like, he's the goofball. So, I love that. I love that for her.
There's one character not really worth mentioning. Just, I need to know, if you get around to watching this again, I need you to take a look at that guy who played the retired cop and tell me if he looks like Robert De Niro to you. Because I kept seeing Robert De Niro in that guy, and then he's like delivering his lines. He's like, I can't do a De Niro impression. But he's, well, just don't tell him I let you fish here. You know, it is like, it was so, in that moment, that sounds like, son of a bitch, this guy is Korean Robert De Niro.
It had not occurred to me until you pointed it out, and I'm looking at him now, and I'm like, huh.
Yeah. I literally wrote a note that just says police chief equals De Niro. But yeah, I think that when we look at all those characters, like you said, we basically spent the entire story talking about those main two. And so now we need to get to what is the kind of overarching character type.
Right.
This is the month of the vampire, so we need to discuss what the vampires are like in this and what we like and don't like about them comparatively to, centuries of vampire lore. So what do you think about the vampires in this movie?
This was such a classic take on the vampire. And I think that for a movie that is so Eastern, it's so Asian in a lot of ways, for it to take a European story and adapt it, and then to take a European monster and adapt it, and take the story and make it very, very Asian, and then take the monster and make it very traditional.
Yes.
Was bold, because they could have very easily gone with Asian vampire. And we've seen lots of Asian vampires, and they all fucking rock.
Yeah.
But seeing this classic, like, Vlad Dracula style vampire, I loved it.
Yeah, man.
There's something about this monster that just fucking works.
Yeah, we talked last week, and the underlying theme so often with vampire things is just about the dude who wants to be loved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all this guy ever sought before he was a vampire. He sought love from this family. He sought love from the orphanage. He sought love from the church as he joined them. And now he's searching for, now that he has this ability and he's left the church, he's searching for a love that gives back the way that he feels like he's giving. The moment that he decides that Teju is it, You know, he's in 100%, and he's constantly just looking for that level of love to be given back to him. I think that, bizarrely enough, as crazy as this is, and you look at this guy who's he's not a reluctant vampire. He just doesn't want to, feast on live people. But he embraces all of those other things that make him a vampire. So reluctant vampire is not the right way, but he's reluctantly evil. If you look at the concept of the vampire as being an evil entity, right? It's so hard through so many stories to separate the idea of the vampire and evil, as they were essentially created as an allegory for evil. You look, it's like, oh, Vlad Dracula at the time was the grandest evil ever. So yes, we should name this new monster after him. So what we got here was, yes, this extremely classic take, but this guy who explored, he was never self-loathing as a vampire, which, throughout Interview with the Vampire, that was Lestat's biggest problem, right? It wasn't just that he wanted to be a vampire and didn't want to be evil. Dude hated the fact that he was a vampire for so long. Sang-won Yoon embraced it pretty quickly, while then still trying to find loopholes in what is ultimately the evil of being a vampire, which is feasting on somebody. Speaking of comedic parts, when he shows her, he's like, I need to show you my ultimate secret. And she goes running out, and you get this really goofy scene where he's laying on the floor with the blood hose in his mouth, and he's just staring at the door. I mean, all of that stuff. I think that you're right, though, in saying this is a ridiculously classic vampire. They didn't, and yet still feels like it belongs in South Korea. This doesn't feel like Dracula visits Busan. No, right? It feels like the best possible way to adapt something foreign, to show respect to where you came from, but make it relevant to your culture. And that's playing with fire. To take something that is culturally someone else's, to show enough respect about it that it doesn't seem like you're just completely stealing it, but to also make it relatable to your audience. That's a very slippery slope. And I think that Park Chan-wook, I think that he just absolutely dominated with his ability to do that, and gave us an amazing character, an amazing type of vampire that you were able to, even in the throes of the power hungry Teju that we got, you still felt that sympathy for, which is ultimately something that you're never going to sell a good vampire story without, unless your vampire story is 30 Days of Night, which isn't about the vampires. It's about the people. That's not a vampire story. That's a survival story.
Right.
If you are telling a vampire story, if you can't create a sympathetic character with a vampire, ultimately you're going to end up with a garbage movie.
Yeah. And while you were talking, I was reminded of one of the more ridiculous of the Hammer Dracula movies, called The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires. Did you ever see this turd?
No.
And I use that as a term of endearment because it is a rather entertaining turd. With Peter Cushing as Van Helsing, actually.
Yes.
But it was a joint production between Hammer and the Shaw Brothers, who made a bunch of kung fu movies in the 60s and the 70s. And oh boy, it is Dracula meets that sort of Asian, culture, and it's wild. To me, you're right. It doesn't seem out of place. It seems like he caught vampirism
right
through a blood transfusion, and now he is just a Korean vampire.
Yeah.
It seemed very natural. It seemed very normal. And one of the things that I loved about this movie is that everyone knows what a vampire is.
Yeah.
It wasn't one of these movies where everyone suddenly is a fucking idiot.
Right.
And they've never heard of vampirism before. Never. Right? Like, not even in Bats. You know, it's like, oh, you drink blood? I've never heard of that before. Oh, really? You don't have fucking vampire bats where you're from? Really? So I loved that. Like, he immediately knew what he was. He was like, oh, I'm a vampire.
And he's like, yeah, they gave me blood. That's where it came from. Boom.
Yeah.
Mystery solved.
He's a smart guy. You don't fucking need Sherlock Holmes to figure this one out. And then everyone knows as soon as they see it, like, oh, he's a fucking vampire. The fucking blind priest knows it. He knows it. He doesn't have to see the blood. He knows, oh man, is this fucking, I'm gonna fucking drink his blood now, and then I'm gonna be able to see. And no, boom, you're fucking denied.
But man, has there ever been a bolder way to prove to somebody you're a vampire than to cut your chest open and shove their hand in there so they can squeeze your heart?
God, what a funny fucking line when he's like, can you please not squeeze my heart so tight? Oh man. Yeah, I loved this very classic take on the vampire. Maybe it's because the most amount of time I've spent with vampires in cinema is definitely the Universal monsters and the Hammer horror vampires, which are very, very traditional. They love to drink blood and they love to fuck and they hate to go out in the sun. And that's what you have here. But you have all of the power and the charm and the charisma that we see in some of those like neo-contemporary classic vampire stories, like The Vampire Lestat, like Interview with the Vampire. And I love that. And I think that vampires are one of those things where it's very easy to fuck with the mythology, like anything. And it's very easy to fuck with the mythology and get it right and get it interesting. But it's also very easy to fuck with the mythology and get it wrong and make me say, no, that's not a vampire. It's so weird what we all recognize as that's a vampire or that's not a vampire. And I think the greatest example of this is What We Do in the Shadows, the TV show, because a character like Colin Robinson, who's not a traditional vampire in any way, I can look at him and I'm like, oh, not only is he a vampire, but vampires are real. And I work with energy vampires.
Yes.
And we all know energy vampires. We're friends with energy vampires. We've got family that's energy vampires. And that is, I think, such an amazing thing that you have this monster that's so adaptable that it could be anything. And yet somehow people still fuck it up. And somehow we're still like amazed when we see it done new and old. And we're still like, oh, look how fucking fresh that is. Because I'm watching this and I'm like, what a fresh take on vampires. I haven't seen that shit since Dracula. And it's not fresh at all. But it's just done with such energy, such fervor. I don't know. There's something about this take. It didn't remind me of Hammer. It didn't remind me of Universal. And yet it did.
Right.
And something about it makes it traditional. And something about it makes it totally new. And maybe it's just that it's Korean Dracula. I don't know. But I whatever it was, I fucking loved it.
Yeah, with you 100%. It was so very good, and you're right. It's Korean Dracula, and I'm okay with that. So, I mean, that's it. That takes us to the end, right? So it's about time that we got to rating this thing. So if you are new to the show, or you just need a quick refresher, when we rate a movie, we don't rate it against anything else. So while we have mentioned other movies like Interview with the Vampire, Dracula, Nosferatu, all of those things, we're not actually comparing Thirst to those movies. We're just looking at what's presented to us here, what we enjoyed, whether or not it did what it was supposed to do. So for every movie that we rate, we create a unique rating system. And for this one, Dave, I need to know, out of a possible 5 bandaged saints, what do you give Thirst?
This movie's absolutely perfect. The only reason it's not going to get 6 is because I've literally finished watching it today.
Right.
And I know myself, and I'm the type of person that rides a high. And so like maybe next week I'd be like, oh, you know, like maybe I shouldn't have given it 6 bandaged saints. Like maybe only 5. Maybe it's only like perfect and not perfect.
Right.
And so for that reason alone, it's going to be 5 Bandage Saints. But this is a movie that, like, right away, I was like, I got to recommend it to this guy. I got to recommend it to this guy. I got to recommend it to this other fucking guy. That fucking guy on the street, I never met him before, but I'm going to recommend it to that guy too, because maybe he's a cool dude. So, and if he's not, he's going to watch it, and then he's going to be a cool dude because he watched this fucking movie. So fuck, man, it's so perfect.
Yeah, look, I'm right there with you. The only reason I am not giving this 6 out of 5 Bandage Saints is because I'm less than 24 hours of watching it. I started it less than 24 hours ago, right? So, and it is, longer, but it does not drag. At no point does it drag in its
Not
2
at
hours.
all.
And so I think that for being fresh while feeling familiar, I think that while presenting characters that are extremely memorable, I will forever remember the looks on their faces as certain things were happening, because these characters are going to stick with me. I think that, a year from now, if we were to be like, hey, remember we did vampires? Yeah, I've gone back, watched Thirst a couple times since then. It's definitely 6. But for right now, I'm going to go with 5 out of 5 Bandage Saints.
And interestingly, you mentioned the length of the movie. So I noted the length of the movie when it started. I was like, okay, 2 hours 15, maybe a little longer than the average movie that we do, but horror movies tend to be a little short. So, like, cool, I'm on board. And then it felt like the movie was wrapping up.
Yeah.
And I was like, hang on, this couldn't have been 2 hours or 15 minutes. I could have sworn it was like half an hour, and it wasn't. It was like half the movie. There was still another like 45 minutes or something left. And I was like, holy fuck, I've watched more than half this movie, and there's still so much more. I'm like, oh, I don't know what's coming next, but there's a third act that's going to blow my fucking mind. And sure enough, it did.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So there you have it. That is a certified and unified 5 out of 5 Bandage Saints for Thirst from Park Chan-Wook. I mean, it was definitely a good one. And so we are going to take a pause on the month of the vampire next week, because something that we have been talking about on our Instagram, we've mentioned a few times on here, Late Night with the Devil is coming to Shudder this week. And so we have been chomping at the bit to watch this thing. So now that we're going to have the ability to stream it, we are going to take a slight pause, and we are going to do Late Night with the Devil next week. So if you are listening now, you should be up by the time this drops. It should be on Shudder. Get out there, watch it. Join us for that one. A lot of people have been talking about this movie. Maybe you're fortunate enough to live in a city that doesn't suck like me and just showed it at shitty times. I swear to you, it's like the theater here in town knew what me and Hunger's schedule was and only showed that movie once a day whenever we couldn't make it. There was one time it was like, okay, let's go see it on Sunday. I was like, cool, I'm free early afternoon. He's like, it's only showing at 7:22. And I was like, okay, 7:22. I can do that
exact time.
I was like, 7:22. I can do that on Tuesday. He goes, bad news. 3:06 on Tuesday. And I was like, what the shit are they doing?
You haven't even left work at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So very excited to catch this one. Give it a watch. Join us next week. If you're wondering where you can join us, head to shiverpod.com, where you will find links to all of our social media, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter. We stream live on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube every week. That's how you can join in the conversation next week for Late Night with the Devil.
Absolutely. So on behalf of all of us here at Shiver, fight your